Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in the criminal law. In this lesson, what we're going to be doing is talking about fraud, specifically fraud by false representation. Now, this is the first of the major elements of the offence of fraud. Now, what I would be instructing you to think about when you look at these various different pieces of legislation is the fact that fundamentally they all have the same underlying fundamental principles. Fraud is and can be seen either as one single offence with lots of different elements to the offence, or lots of different types and ways in which the offence may be committed, or it could be seen as lots of different offences. I prefer to choose to think about it more as really the idea of fraud being one fundamental idea, but that is committed in lots of different ways, okay? And you will see why I think this is the case, given the fact that, at least fundamentally, at least when it comes to the fundamental principles that relate to fraud, they stretch across each of the different types of ways in which one can commit fraud. The only difference between fraud by false representation and fraud by abuse of position, for example, is the ways in which you commit the fraud. This lesson, as I've mentioned, is going to talk about fraud by false representation. Now, fraud by false representation is codified in Section 2 of the legislation, the Fraud Act of 2006. And it says that when it comes to fraud by false representation, a person is in breach of this section if he dishonestly makes a false representation and intends by making the representation to make a gain for himself or another, or to cause loss to another, or to expose another to a risk of loss. It's as simple as that. We'll get to this in a second. Fundamentally, then, there are lots of different ways and lots of different fundamental principles that not only exist in and around all fraud cases and fraud offences, but also, for the most part, any kind of property offence. So the idea of dishonesty is present in this idea of fraud by false representation. Of course, the concept of dishonesty, we can link all the way back to the cases of Ivy, the cases of Barton, the case of Ghosh, for example, all of which are cases that involve theft. However, or not even all of them involve theft, but the idea of dishonesty is consistent across theft and fraud. So in order to commit fraud by false representation, you first have to dishonestly make a false representation. We'll get to what this means in a second, in a couple of seconds' time. And then there has to be an intent. So whereas, for example, theft is the dishonest appropriation of property with the intent to permanently deprive, fraud by false representation is the dishonest making of a false representation with the intent to gain or to cause another loss or risk of loss. This is essentially you can see very clearly here that theft and fraud are very, very similar offences and have very, very similar parallels between them. It's such that even their definitions are quite similar as well. Section 2, subsection 2, talks about the idea of the false representation. It defines what it means when it suggests that a representation is false. It says that a representation is false if it is untrue, or if it is misleading, and the person making it knows that it is, or that it might be, untrue or misleading. Subsection 3 says that representation. So we've thought about what fraud is in section 2, subsection 1, defining what fraud is, making a false representation with the view to gain or to cause another to lose. We've defined what makes a representation false, i.e., something that is untrue or misleading, or the person the person making it knows that it is untrue or might be untrue or misleading. And then finally, subsection 3, it defines what a representation is. A representation means any representation as to fact or law, including a representation as to the state of mind of the person making the representation, of any other person. So a representation is simply a way in which you can present fact or law, including that of a state of mind of the person who is making that representation, or even the state of mind of any other person. So that's what the offence of fraud by false representation actually is, and what it requires. Let's think about the mens rea element then. It's relatively simple to understand, does not take too much to get your head around in terms of trying to work out what the mens rea is. Fundamentally, just like with the concept of theft, the mens rea for fraud by false representation is dishonesty, as defined in Ivy. And so when we look at the concept of dishonesty, we would make the same comparison between theft and when we look at fraud. It should be noted, however, that the Theft Act, Section 2 on dishonesty, does not apply to fraud cases. It is the common law understanding of dishonesty rather than the ways in which they define dishonesty in the 68 Theft Act itself. In addition to this, there is also an intentionality requirement. If you notice here, there is an intention by making the false representation to gain for himself or another, or to cause another, to expose another to a risk of loss. So fundamentally, the mens rea requirements for false representation as part of Section 2 of the Fraud Act includes, first, this idea of dishonesty as defined by the case of Ivy and then subsequently by the case of Barton. And then secondly, this intentionality requirement, that you make a false representation with the intent to gain for yourself or for another, or to cause loss to another, or to expose another to a risk of a particular amount of loss. So that's what we mean when we talk about the mens rea requirement. And then finally, just as a quick disclaimer for mens rea, as I've noted here, Section 2 of the 1968 Theft Act, as we remember back to previous lessons, fundamentally just defines what is meant by dishonesty as part of the remit of the Theft Act. That definition of dishonesty in the Theft Act does not apply to fraud cases. Only the definition of dishonesty, as we see in the cases of things like Ivy, for example, are representative of the concept of dishonesty that stretches across to fraud cases. So the Theft Act is speaking specifically about theft. The Fraud Act speaks specifically about fraud. The case of Ivy talks about the concept of dishonesty more broadly, given that it wasn't even a criminal case, but a civil case. To illustrate this point then, finally, let's talk about the 1982 case of Lambie. This was a case in which a defendant had been using a credit card which had taken and exceeded their exceeded their limit, its limit itself. At this point, it would be ordinarily proper for the individual who owns that credit card to return the credit card, but instead she decided to make another purchase with this credit card which had exceeded its limit. It was argued that this amounted to a case of fraud by false representation, and the House of Lords concluded that when the defendant presented the credit card which had been exceeded, this amounted to a representation. And specifically, it was a false representation, because the representation that she had made in presenting this credit card was one of the authority on the part of the defendant to make the purchase, i.e., I have this credit card here, and it therefore means that I can validly make a purchase on this credit card, when in reality she could not. This credit card had exceeded its limit, and so the result was that the representation was false. The representation was therefore false, and of course, in the fact that she wanted to purchase an item using this exceeded credit card, she was using this false representation with an intent to gain, which of course then represents fraud for the legislation.